They came the way all conquerors come, with paperwork. The documents arrived 6 months before the first ship broke atmosphere over the Pacific. Thick packets of dense, translated text, stamped with the seal of the Vorkai Administrate, and delivered through the same diplomatic channels that had brokered the initial contact 3 years prior. The humans who read them, career bureaucrats, 3 translators, and one very tired professor of xenolinguistics from the University of Edinburgh, described the sensation as opening a package and finding a bill for every meal you'd ever eaten. The Vorkai did not conquer. They administered. There was a difference, they explained, and the difference was important to them, in a way that the humans, still reading the fine print at 4 a.m, with cold coffee and scotch, tape holding their sanity together, were only beginning to understand. Conquest was temporary. Administration was permanent. The facility at Gotemba came first. Built on the lower slopes of Fuji in a valley that the Vorkai environmental teams had declared optimal for their purposes: good drainage, temperate climate, proximity to a large body of deep water. It went up in 11 days. The humans, who watched it rise from the highway below, described the construction as less like building and more like unfolding. The Vorkai did not pour concrete or drive steel. They grew their structures from seed compounds, and the result looked nothing like anything built by human hands. Smooth surfaces the color of old bone. No corners, only gradients. Windows that were not windows, but something the Vorkai called VES. Sensory apertures that registered more of the spectrum than any human eye could use. The sign outside the main gate was the only human legible element of the entire structure. It read, in clean sans serif Japanese and English both, Vorkai Human Enhancement and Assessment Center, Facility 3. Nobody asked what happened at Facilities 1 and 2. Miyako Sato was 17 when the selection notice came. She found it between a phone bill and a credit card statement, in the narrow slot of the apartment mailbox, tucked as though it belonged there, which was somehow worse than if it had been delivered with ceremony. Her mother read it twice, put it on the kitchen table, and made tea. Her father read it once, and went to stand on the balcony for a long time, looking at the stretch of the city below, at the neon and the orange sodium lights reflecting in the wet streets. The notice explained that Miyako had been selected for the Vorkai Youth Assessment Program, a 12-week residential evaluation at Facility 3 beginning on the 1st of April. Selection was based on a proprietary matrix of academic performance, physiological metrics, gathered during the routine health screening that all Japanese school children had undergone 18 months prior, and what the document called adaptive potential indexing. Attendance was not optional. The notice used the word mandatory 6 times in 4 paragraphs, and not once with apology. Miyako was a swimmer, had been since she was 4 years old. Since her grandfather, who believed that the Pacific Ocean was the only honest thing left in the modern world, had taken her to the beach at Kamakura and walked her into the waves until she stopped being afraid. She held 3 school records in freestyle events and had been told by her coach, a compact, weathered woman named Noguchi, who had herself competed at the national level, that she had a real chance at the prefectural championships in the spring. The notice did not mention the championships. It mentioned April 1st, and it mentioned the word mandatory, and it left very little room for anything else. She packed a single duffel bag. Her mother pressed a photograph into her hand at the door. The family at Kamakura. Miyako waist-deep in summer surf, laughing at something off camera. Her grandfather's hand on her shoulder. She put it in the bag's front pocket and did not look at it again for 2 weeks. There were 11 other girls on the bus from Gotemba Station. Miyako did not know any of them, but she recognized the particular way they held themselves, straight-backed, chin level, the careful stillness of someone trying not to show anything. They had all received the same notice. They had all packed bags that looked like they contained slightly too little for 12 weeks, and slightly too much to feel okay about. None of them talked on the ride up. The facility greeted them with a sound, before it greeted them with a sight, a low, sub-bass thrum that Miyako felt in her back teeth rather than heard, the kind of vibration that old stories attributed to temples, and that her nervous system immediately filed under wrong. Then the valley opened and the facility was there, bone-white and seamless against the dark green of the mountain, and Miyako thought, "It looks like it grew here. It looks like it has always been here. It looks like the mountain tolerates it, the way a body tolerates a splinter." The administrator who met them at the gate was human. That was the first surprise. A tall man with the careful posture of someone who had learned to hold himself a particular way and had been doing it so long he'd forgotten it was learned. His name badge said Seijin Mizuki, facility coordinator, and he smiled with the portion of his face above his teeth in a way that did not involve his eyes at all. "Welcome," he said, in the practiced cadence of someone who had said the word so many times it had lost its original meaning entirely. "You've been selected because you are exceptional. We expect you to remain exceptional. The program here is demanding. It is demanding because demand is how excellence is produced. You'll find the schedule in your intake packets." He handed each of them a sealed envelope. Inside, a schedule printed in both Japanese and the clean angular script of Vorkai administrative notation. Every hour was accounted for. Wake at 0500. Training from 0530 to 0800. Assessment from 0800 to noon. Conditioning from noon to 1500. Performance evaluation from 1500 to 1800. Meals scheduled. Sleep scheduled. There was a note at the bottom of the schedule in small text. Deviation from the program timeline without authorization constitutes a Level 2 assessment failure. Level 2 failures are subject to remediation protocols. Level 3 failures are subject to enhanced remediation protocols. Nobody explained what remediation meant. Miyako noticed that nobody asked. The Vorkai supervisor they met that first evening was called, in the phonetic approximation that the facility's materials offered, Res Vorat Keen. The humans at the facility had taken to calling him the director, which was simpler and which he did not appear to object to. He was not large by Vorkai standards. Barely 2.5 meters. His body's natural bilateral symmetry disrupted by the 3 additional manipulator limbs that grew from the central trunk of his torso, which the Vorkai used for fine work the way humans used their hands. His coloring was a deep blue-gray, with patterns of bioluminescence along the lateral lines of his flanks that pulsed slowly in what the xenolinguistic materials described as a neutral administrative affect. He had at some point done something to his own face. The Vorkai face was not designed for human reading, flat where human faces were convex. The sensory organs arranged in a cluster rather than a pair. The communication structures below the sensory cluster, capable of generating sounds across a range that extended well beyond human hearing. But the director's face had been modified. Someone, him presumably, or someone working with his consent, had grafted human analog features onto the lower portion of his head. A mouth that moved in rough synchrony with his speech, a pair of amber-colored optical units positioned where human eyes would be. The effect was not reassuring. It was the visual equivalent of a translation that is technically correct but wrong in every way that matters. "You are here," he said, through a voter box clipped to his torso, his human voice clear and uninflected, "because you represent something worth measuring. Humans are variable. Variability is inefficiency. Our program is designed to locate the sources of variability in your performance and eliminate them. You will leave here more consistent, more predictable, more useful." He paused. The bioluminescence along his flanks shifted pattern. Those who do not improve will be assessed for remediation. In the bunk room that night, after lights out, Miyako lay on her back and stared at the ceiling, which, like every ceiling in the facility, was not flat but gently curved. A surface that breathed in some barely perceptible way that made the walls feel like the inside of something alive. In the next bunk, a girl named Haruki who swam butterfly and had a small tattoo of a dragonfly on her left wrist was very quietly crying. Not loud enough to be a sob, just the barely there sound of someone keeping something in with the last of their strength. Miyako said nothing. She reached across the gap between their bunks in the dark and put her hand on the edge of Haruki's mattress. Not touching, just there. After a while, the crying stopped. The pool was magnificent. She had to give them that. Olympic dimensions but deeper, the water temperature calibrated to within 1/10 of a degree of ideal performance range, the lane markings crisp, and the starting blocks fitted with sensor pads that logged times to the millisecond. Everything else in the facility was alien in a way that pushed at the edges of comfort. But the pool was the pool, 50 meters of water with lane ropes and a pace clock, and the smell of chlorine that was the same smell as every pool Miyako had ever swum in, from the cramped municipal facility where she'd learned to dive at age 6, to the prefectural training center where Coach Noguchi had pushed her through enough sets to make her arms feel like rubber tubing. She stood at the block for her first assessment swim and let the smell settle her. Behind her, she was aware of the monitoring equipment, drones the size of hummingbirds that hovered at the edges of her vision, the sensor array built into the lane ropes, the director watching from behind what looked like a viewing window, but was probably something else entirely. She was aware of being watched, measured, cataloged. She was aware that somewhere a number was being generated that would determine something about her near future. She thought. My grandfather taught me that the water is the only honest thing. She dove. She swam the 200-meter freestyle the way Noguchi had taught her. Not chasing the clock, just swimming, each stroke an argument for something she couldn't name. The turn at the 100-meter wall, clean and deep, and the last 50 meters with her lungs, burning in a way that felt, against all reason, almost good. She touched the wall. She looked up at the pace clock. She had swum 2 seconds slower than her personal best. The assessment technician, another human, a young man who had been at the facility for several months and had developed the particular flat effect of someone who had received a great deal of remediation, consulted his board and noted, without inflection, below projection. Adjustment indicated. Miyako did not say anything. She climbed out of the pool, collected her towel, and went to join the others. The adjustment came that afternoon. The remediation room was on the east side of the facility, in a wing that smelled differently from the rest of the building. Not bad, exactly, but sharp the way the air smells before a thunderstorm, as though something electrical was perpetually on the verge of discharge. The walls were the same bone white as everything else, and the chairs were human size, but not quite right. Calibrated for average dimensions, which meant that they fit nobody correctly. Miyako sat in the chair. The technician attached sensor pads to her arms, her shoulders, the base of her neck. The adjustment is a light stress stimulus, he explained. It produces momentary discomfort. The purpose is to establish a neurological association between suboptimal performance and an aversive response. The association creates an efficiency incentive. You shock us when we swim slowly, said a girl named Keiko, who was sitting in the adjacent chair and who had already been through one adjustment cycle. Her voice was utterly flat. She'd developed the flat voice in the first week. They all had, to varying degrees. The stimulus is calibrated to cause discomfort without injury, the technician said. He said it the way someone says something they have said many times. Miyako looked at the sensor pads on her arms. She thought about the pace clock. She thought about Noguchi, who had pushed her through enough sets to break her and then pushed her some more, but who had pushed with something the facility did not seem to possess some. The technician's voice had no room for. She tried to name it and couldn't. She let it be. The adjustment happened. The technician was correct that it produced discomfort. It was a precisely metered discomfort, which was in its own way worse than random pain. She went back to the pool the next day and swam the 200 again. She swam 1 second slower. She could see, from the corner of her eye, the adjustment technician making a note. Res Vorat Keen watched the human data compile with the particular satisfaction of a scientist who has correctly predicted an experiment's early phase. The variability charts confirmed what the Vorkai behavioral models had projected. Initial exposure to structured correction protocols produced a performance dip, followed by a correction plateau, followed, in compliance subjects, by measurable improvement. This was how the Vorkai had optimized every client species they'd encountered, removed the inefficiencies, standardized the outputs. The species that complied flourished in the Vorkai definition of flourishing, which involved useful work and predictable behavior, and very little else. He reviewed the human files with his manipulator limbs, scrolling through metrics. Subject 12, Sato, Miyako, was an outlier in the expected direction. Her performance had declined slightly faster than the model projected, which sometimes indicated a subject who would respond more dramatically to the correction protocol the way a spring wound too tight releases with greater force. He noted the projection and moved to the next file, what the model did not contain, because the Vorkai had not yet learned to build models for it, was any representation of what happened in the bunks after lights out. What happened when Haruki whispered to Miyako that her left shoulder was doing that thing again, the hitch in the catch that added drag, and Miyako demonstrated the correction in the air above their bunks, both of them miming strokes in the dark. What happened when a girl named Sarah, who had been identified as a remediation risk, and who wept into her pillow every night, with the systematic exhaustion of someone who had run out of other options, had her shampoo quietly replaced by the group's communal supply after the facility confiscated for an undisclosed administrative reason. The Vorkai model had no entry for what humans do in the dark when no one is watching them be optimized. It also had no entry for what had been appearing sporadically on the facility's exterior walls. The first incident was logged on the 14th day. A maintenance drone doing a routine sweep of the building's exterior east wall registered a deviation in the surface coating. Something applied to the bone-white polymer from outside, in characters that the drone's visual processing identified as human script. By the time a technician was dispatched to investigate, the morning fog had thickened, and the writing was gone, dissolved or wiped, but the drone's image capture was clear enough. What it said in Japanese was, "You are not alone." The director reviewed the image and filed it under Authorized Communication, Category B. Unsanctioned Morale Intervention, Source Unknown. He flagged it for monitoring and moved on. Unsanctioned morale interventions were a known category. They appeared in approximately 12% of assessment program implementations across species. They were generally the product of local dissident elements operating from incomplete information. The correct response was increased surveillance, not alarm. The second incident was on day 20. This time the writing appeared on the inside of the pool changing room, where no external drone would have caught it. In red marker on the wall behind the mirror, it said, "Sink or swim your way, not theirs." The third incident, on day 27, was not writing. It was a woman. Miyako saw her first. She was doing the last set of the evening training block, the pool quiet, and the other girls already at the showers, and she was alone in lane 4, working through the backstroke drill that Noguchi had drilled into her, the one that felt wrong for the first 20 strokes and then, somewhere past the pain, clicked into something that felt like flying. She was at the turning wall, finishing the drill, her fingers touching tile. She looked up, and there was a figure sitting on the edge of the pool in lane 6. Sitting on the edge, feet in the water, wearing, in the sterile fluorescent light of the facility pool, a red scarf around her neck, red gloves, red boots that laced to the knee, and a red mask that wrapped close around her eyes and the bridge of her nose, and nothing else. Nothing else at all. Miyako had been in the facility for 27 days. In 27 days, she had learned to screen her reactions, to hold her face in the neutral calibrated expression that drew the least attention from the technicians. She had learned not to react, so the fact that her first response, looking up from the turning wall at a naked masked woman sitting calmly at the edge of the pool at 10 o'clock at night was a sharp, involuntary bark of what might have been laughter. That told her something about how much of herself she'd been compressing. The woman put a finger to her lips. Miyako, water still streaming from her hair, pulled herself up onto the pool edge and sat. 6 feet of water separated them. The monitoring drones, she had figured out in week 2, had a rotation pattern. There was a 4-minute gap in their sweep of this end of the pool. She did not ask how the woman knew about the gap, because the answer seemed obvious. "They're going to escalate the protocol," the woman said quietly. Her voice was low, and even, not whispered, whispers carried. At the end of week 4, they do it in every cycle. The performance pressure increases, and they move to what they call enhanced remediation. You need to know about it before it happens. "Who are you?" Miyako said. The woman looked at her through the mask with dark, steady eyes. "Someone who's been watching this place since before you arrived." "Where do you come from?" "That's less important than what I'm telling you." Miyako pushed her wet hair back from her face. She was cold from the pool and the air on her damp skin, and something else. Some particular coldness that was not physical, and she was also, beneath that, running an assessment of her own. The woman knew about the drone rotation. She had gotten into the pool area without triggering any alert that Miyako had heard. She had been watching the facility for weeks, and she was sitting here with the particular quality of composure that belongs to people who are either very calm or very angry, and have had a lot of time to practice making the two look identical. "Enhanced remediation," Miyako said. "The adjustment stimulus, which is currently calibrated at level 1, moves to level 3. It's supposed to be the push that converts resistant subjects to compliance. What it actually does," the woman paused just briefly, "is break some people and make others angrier." "Which is it for you?" The woman smiled. It was not a wide smile, but it was genuine, the kind of smile that has decided something and found that decision sufficient. "I've been coming back here for 3 cycles, she said. "That answer your question?" Miyako said nothing for a moment. "Then what do we do?" "You keep swimming. You swim your way. When the escalation comes, you do not let them recalibrate what good swimming means to you. They're going to tell you there's a right way to be fast, and it looks like their way. It doesn't. Fast is fast. Fast looks like you. That's it? That's the plan? The plan has more parts, but that's the part that's yours." She stood, fluid and easy, and the red cape she wore, that Miyako had not noticed until this moment, fell back into place across her shoulders in the water-cooled air. "There's a swim meet on the last day. That's what the whole 12 weeks is building toward. They want your best time on record, on their equipment, in their conditions. They want your personal best to belong to their data. And we don't let them have it. You swim your fastest in the last 10 meters, when they're expecting you to tire. You do the thing they've been trying to train out of you." She glanced at the pool. "The thing you do on the straight, that roll in your right shoulder on the final push. I've seen you do it when you think no one's watching. It's not regulation form. It's yours. It adds about 1.5 seconds to your time over 200 meters. Miyako stared at her. "You've been timing me. I've been paying attention." A drone hummed at the far end of the pool, beginning its sweep. The woman moved to the pool edge and slipped into the water without sound, without splash, the way something that knows water intimately enters it, not disturbing joining. And then she was gone, and the water closed over where she had been. And Miyako sat on the pool edge in the fluorescent quiet with her feet in the lane 6 of water and heart doing something complicated in her chest. She went back to her bunk that night and lay on her back and stared at the breathing ceiling and thought about what it meant that a naked masked woman knew about the particular role in her right shoulder that Noguchi had tried unsuccessfully for 3 years to coach out of her. She thought it meant that someone had been watching her swim the way her grandfather had watched the ocean, not for what it was supposed to do, but for what it actually did. She slept better than she had in 3 weeks. Week 4 arrived on schedule, as all administrative escalations do. Coordinator Mizuki gathered the 12 girls in the assessment hall on the morning of day 28 and read from a prepared document in the careful cadence of someone being very precise about what is and is not their personal decision. He explained that the program was entering its performance optimization phase. He explained that the assessment criteria would be recalibrated. He explained that the adjustment protocols would be enhanced to level 3, and that this was a standard program feature, not a response to any individual failure, and that the objective was the production of measurable excellence in controlled conditions. He said this with the face of a man who had at some point made a choice and was living inside it now, and had gotten used to the dimensions. Keiko, sitting beside Miyako, wrote 2 characters on the corner of her assessment intake form, while Mizuki was reading. She folded it once and passed it left along the row, hand to hand, until it reached Miyako. Miyako unfolded it in her lap. The character said, "Still us." Miyako folded it back and held it. The level 3 adjustment was more than the level 1. The technician was correct, again, that it produced no injury. It was also correct, in its own way, that it produced more discomfort. What the technician's calibrated assessment did not capture was what Miyako noticed about the room during the adjustment cycle that afternoon. 9 of the 12 girls came out of it with their eyes bright in a particular way that was not the brightness of tears. 3 came out of it with their jaws set. None of them came out of it looking corrected. That evening, in the pool during free swim, the 1 hour per day when the monitoring was lightest, and the technicians were at their administrative rotations, Miyako put her feet on the pool edge and told the others what the masked woman had said. In the low, even voice she had borrowed from her. She expected questions. She got them, but not the ones she expected. Haruki asked, "What does she look like when she swims?" Sarah asked. "Does she know about the data retention policy?" "They're keeping the performance records after we leave. They own our best times." A girl named Tomo, who held the facility record in the 100-meter backstroke, and who had been identified by the technicians as the highest value subject in the current cohort, said, "I've been holding back." Miyako looked at her. "Not on purpose," Tomo said. "Not at first. But I noticed, around week 2, that when I swam my hardest, they increased the monitoring intensity. More sensor nodes in the water. More drone passes. So I started holding back to see what would happen. And when I swam at 90%, the monitoring decreased." She paused. "I didn't tell anyone, because I didn't know what it meant. It means they scale the measurement apparatus to what they think you're capable of," said Sarah. "If we swim under their projection on the meet day." "They don't get accurate data," said Miyako. "They get the data we decide to give them." The water was still around them, and the pace clock ticked on the wall, and outside the facility the mountain was dark, and the valley was dark, star, and somewhere in the dark, something that wore a red mask was watching, or not watching, or doing something the monitoring drones could not categorize. Miyako thought about her grandfather, who had walked her into the Pacific at age 4 and held her hand while the waves came, and who had said, at some point, that she could no longer precisely locate in time, but which had become foundational, structural, load-bearing. The water doesn't care what you think you can do. The water just is. So you have to be too. "We have 11 days, she said. The Vorkai performance model for the final assessment was based on a trend line extrapolated from 5 weeks of monitored data. Resverat Keen reviewed it the night before the meet and found it satisfactory. The model predicted that the 12 human subjects would collectively achieve performance metrics approximately 12% above their documented pre-program baselines, with individual variance within acceptable parameters. Subject 12, Sato, was projected to register a personal best in the 200-meter freestyle, which would provide a clean data point for the adaptive potential indexing section of the quarterly report. He was not thinking about what he had observed of the human subjects in the evenings, because he had not observed them in the evenings. The monitoring protocols, reduced intensity, during free periods per standard program design. Sustained high-intensity monitoring produced subject awareness of surveillance which contaminated performance metrics. He had reviewed the anomaly reports, the writing on the walls, the single incident of the unauthorized intruder, logged on day 27, and had determined that none of them represented a security threat. The intruder had triggered no alarms and had been in the facility for less than 5 minutes by drone sweep correlation. Whatever message, if any, had been communicated was too brief to constitute a meaningful disruption. The Vorkai's best models of human social behavior were built on observation of humans under conditions of full compliance. They were excellent models. They were just not, as it happened, the model that was currently applicable. The meet day was also the last day of April, and the mountain above the facility had been in mist for 3 days running, the kind of slow gray weather that sits on the shoulders of things and makes everything feel slightly underwater. The pool was lit to full intensity, and the monitoring array had been brought to maximum resolution. Every sensor node active, every drone in position. Coordinator Mizuki stood at the pool's edge with a tablet and an expression that had been ironed smooth by administrative habit. The director sat in the observation space above the pool, his bioluminescence in the pattern. The behavioral materials described as focused interest. The 12 girls took their starting positions. Miyako stood at the block in lane 4 and looked at the pool. 50 meters of water, the tiles she'd been counting for weeks, the lane ropes and the pace clock, and the smell that was the same smell as Kamakura, and the municipal pool, and the prefectural training center, where Noguchi had pushed her through the sets that broke her and pushed her some more. She thought about the masked woman's voice. Fast is fast. Fast looks like you. She thought about the roll in her right shoulder, the hitch that added a second and a half, and that no one had ever been able to coach out of her, which she had come to understand was not a flaw in her stroke, but a signature. The way the body insists on being itself, even when being told it is. Wrong, she thought. We are going to give them exactly what they came here for, she thought. We are just not going to give it to them in the way they expected. The starting beep fired. She dove. The first 100 meters she swam clean. Technically precise. Every element in its correct place. The form she had built through years of practice. The form that was hers, and not the facility's version. The form that Noguchi had spent 3 seasons trying to refine without ever quite removing the parts that were irreducibly Miyako. She swam the first 100 at 90%, and she could feel the sensor nodes in the water, and the drones overhead, and the careful gaze of the data collection. Apparatus tracking her progress, and building its models, and she gave them everything they expected. At the 100-meter wall she went into her turn, deep, clean, the push off the wall, with both feet hitting at exactly the right moment, and came out of the turn, already pushing into the second 50, and this was where the facility's model said she would begin to slow. Because this was where the model predicted the cost of the training would show, the residual fatigue, from 5 weeks of high-intensity conditioning, creating a performance ceiling that the program had been specifically designed to raise. The model was not wrong about the existence of a ceiling. It was simply working from an incorrect assumption about where the ceiling was. She hit the second 50 at full capacity, not 90%. Not the careful management of a body that has been conditioned to treat caution as efficiency, full capacity, which she had not shown in 5 weeks of monitored performance, which she had been hoarding the way her grandfather had told her once, that the ocean hoards, not miserly, not afraid, just conserving for the moment when conservation ends and the wave breaks. She felt the hitch in her right shoulder coming at the 60-meter mark, the natural asymmetry that a dozen coaches had tried to standardize. And she didn't suppress it, she used it, the body knowing something the model didn't. The additional rotation pulling her hip through, in a way that generated force at the point in the stroke, cycle when the force was most useful. When the arm was extended and the pull began, the whole right side of her body working in a pattern that was not regulation, and was not optimal in any measurable way, and was nevertheless hers, from her first swim lesson to the pool at Kamakura, to the prefectural training center, to this fluorescent-lit alien monitoring room on the slope of a mountain at the end of April. Hers from the beginning, and still hers, and nobody's else's. She touched the wall. She looked up at the pace clock. Somewhere above the pool she heard something she had not heard inside the facility in 5 weeks. It took her a moment to identify it, because the sound had been so systematically absent that she had almost forgotten what it sounded like. Someone was cheering, not one of the girls, though they were, she realized, looking down the lane lines at the other swimmers coming in, shouting across the water to each other. Not Coordinator Mizuki, whose face had taken on an expression that she recognized as belonging to people who are recalibrating in real time. Not the director, whose bioluminescence was doing something rapid and complex that she had never seen before. The cheering was coming from outside the pool. It was coming from the maintenance access corridor that ran along the south wall of the pool facility, an internal corridor that the drones did not cover during active meat monitoring because it was behind the primary sensor array, and from the maintenance corridor's service door, which was open approximately 8 inches, which should not have been possible because it was a security door with a Vorkai lock, came a sound that Miyako's nervous system recognized before her brain did. Someone laughing. Low and warm and entirely unintimidated, the director rose from his observation position. His manipulator limbs extended in what was, even cross-species, recognizable as controlled alarm. He had received 3 anomaly reports about unauthorized facility presence. He had categorized all 3 as minor disruptions. He was, in this moment, recategorizing. Locate the unauthorized presence, he said through his voder, and the monitoring drones pivoted from the pool and redirected toward the south wall. The service door opened fully. She came in on foot. Miyako had expected the motorcycle, but the corridor was not wide enough. Moving with the ease of someone entering a space they have already memorized. Red mask, red gloves, red boots, red scarf, and the red cape moving behind her in the air displaced by the opening door, and underneath it, the absolute unconcerned confidence of a body that has decided it will not hide from anything in any room. Coordinator Mizuki stepped toward her. He was a tall man, and he had the posture of someone who had been given institutional authority and had held it long enough to mistake it for personal power. He said in his careful administrative voice, "This is a restricted facility. You are in violation of." She hit him with a spinning heel kick that started from her left hip and finished at approximately the level of his right ear, and he sat down abruptly on the pool deck and stayed there with the expression of someone reviewing a long series of decisions. The drones descended. She moved through them, the way a swimmer moves through turbulent water, not avoiding the turbulence, using it. Her nunchaku came from somewhere Miyako did not track, and she was already in the middle of the drone formation, each strike placed with the particular economy of someone who has practiced something so many times. It has left the realm of thought and entered the realm of reflex. The drones just, one by one, in a pattern that had an almost rhythmic quality, like a pace she was keeping with herself. The director descended from the observation level, his 3 manipulator limbs extended. He was 2.5 meters of optimized alien biology, and he was, Miyako could see from his bioluminescence pattern, genuinely angry. The patterns had gone sharp and rapid and bright. Nothing like the controlled, neutral administrative readings she'd been tracking for 5 weeks. "You have disrupted an authorized assessment program," he said. "You interfered with Vorkai administrative process. You." She looked up at him with the dark eyes behind the red mask, and she said, in a voice that was entirely even, "I've done this 3 times now." And then she smiled, and the smile was the one Miyako had seen in the pool that first night. The smile that has decided something, and found the decision enough. What she did next should not have worked. The Vorkai were stronger than humans and faster than humans in short-distance motion, and their biology had redundancies built in by evolutionary pressures that made them, in several important respects, more durable. The director was twice her mass and had 3 additional limbs, and had been governing this facility for 18 months through compliance and correction protocols that had optimized a dozen cohorts of humans into something more predictable and less themselves. What she did was not strength, and it was not speed, and it was not anything the director's threat response training had prepared for. She dropped under his first reach and reversed direction in a way that required her to be in 2 positions, sequentially that should not have been physically achievable, and she came up inside the reach of his manipulator limbs, where he could not use them without bending them in directions they did not bend, and she put both her hands on his sensory cluster, and she made a sound that Miyako would never be able to adequately describe to anyone who hadn't been there, that her brain would file under wrong in the same folder as the facility's construction. A sound that was, apparently at a frequency that the Vorkai sensory cluster, which read several more spectra than a human face, found approximately equivalent to what humans experience when someone puts their hands over a speaker and fires it at maximum volume directly into the ear canal. The director recoiled, more than recoiled, stumbled, his bilateral symmetry disrupted, all 5 limbs moving at once to correct a balance problem that was entirely neurological and entirely unanticipated, and in the 3 seconds that it took him to recover his equilibrium, she stepped back, adjusted her grip on the nunchaku, and met the remaining 2 security units that had come in through the main pool entrance. She was, Miyako thought, teaching a lesson, not to the director, to them. The lesson was about being in a room where someone has decided they will not be moved, and what that decision looks like from the outside. The lesson was about the particular human mechanics of absolute stubbornness, which the Vorkai models had entirely failed to map, because they had been building models of compliance and measuring deviation from compliance, and stubbornness is not deviation from compliance. Stubbornness is a different system entirely, operating on different principles, answering to different incentives. The security units went down. The director was upright again, but had not re-engaged, his bioluminescence doing the rapid complex thing that Miyako could not read but that felt, to whatever part of her brain read bodies before language got there, like reassessment. The pool was very quiet. Coordinator Mizuki was still sitting on the pool deck. He put one hand flat on the tile, not to get up, but just to have something solid to touch. The masked woman stood in the center of the pool area in the fluorescent light and looked at the 12 girls in the water and on the blocks and on the pool deck. Her breathing was elevated but controlled. Her red scarf had come slightly undone, and she reached up and straightened it with one gloved hand in a gesture so ordinary, so domestically correct, that Miyako felt something shift inside her chest, some last compression releasing. The performance data from this meet is incomplete, the woman said to the room generally. 4 of the 12 subjects were interrupted before completion. The records are legally inadmissible by Vorkai administrative standards. You have no usable data from this cohort. She was looking at the director when she said it, and the director was running whatever calculation the Vorkai ran. When a projection had diverged significantly from observed outcomes, bioluminescence, shifting slowly back toward something the materials described as neutral administrative, which, in context, looked exactly like a scientist who has had to revise a foundational assumption and is deciding how to proceed. The program, the director said, eventually can be restarted. The program, the woman said, will produce the same result. This is the 3rd cohort I've seen come through this facility. They improve because humans improve when someone believes they can. They resist because humans resist when someone's trying to take something from them. Your model doesn't include either of those variables. A long silence. Then from the water, Haruki said, "She's right about the shoulder." Miyako looked at her. Haruki was looking at Miyako, and there was something in her face, That was the first entirely unmanaged expression Miyako had seen on her since day 1. Your shoulder the roll. I've been watching it all week. It's not a flaw. It's the last 20 meters. It's how you get there. Tomo, from lane 2, said quietly. The facility record I set in week 3 was at 86%. Sarah pulled herself up on the pool edge and sat and looked at the director with the clear, flat eyes of someone who has run completely out of fear and found something useful on the other side. We want our records expunged from your database, she said. All of them. Every time point. Every assessment metric. That's our data. The director's bioluminescence pulsed. The data was collected in accordance with the program parameters. The data was collected from our bodies, Sarah said. Our bodies aren't program parameters. Another silence, longer, of a different quality. The Masat woman was watching the director. The director was watching the 12 girls in various states of wet, exhausted, upright defiance around his pool. Miyako thought, he's recalculating. She thought he has never run a calculation that ended here before. She thought he does not have a model for what a room full of 17-year-old swimmers looks like when they decide in unison that they are done being optimized. She looked at the pace clock on the wall. Her time was still up there, 31 seconds faster than her personal best. She hadn't been tracking it consciously, had been too deep in the swim to look at clocks, but there it was, the number that the facility had been trying to produce from her for 5 weeks, that the adjustment protocols and the remediation rooms and the level 3 stimulus had been calibrated to extract, and she had produced it not when they pushed, but when she stopped letting them push, not in the direction of their model, but in the direction of her own body's knowledge. In the 30 meters of full capacity swimming, and the roll in the right shoulder, and the pull that added a second and a half, and was not regulation. Form and was entirely hers. The director was still looking at the room. Miyako watched the bioluminescence. It was doing something slower now, more regular, and she thought, that's the look of an assumption being revised. That's what it looks like from the outside when a model has to accommodate new data. The records, he said, finally, will be reviewed. It was not what Sarah had asked for. It was also, Miyako understood, not nothing. It was the door opening one increment. It was the beginning of a different negotiation. The woman in the red mask was already moving toward the service corridor. She paused at the door and looked back at the pool, and her eyes found Miyako's through the mask, and she did the smile again. The one that has decided something and found it sufficient. And then she was gone, and the door closed, and the corridor was quiet, and the drones that had been directed toward the south wall banked and found nothing to report. Miyako stood at the edge of the pool in the fluorescent quiet and listened to the water, still moving in the lanes from the commotion, the gentle lap and slap of it against the tiles, the smell of chlorine, the pace clock. She thought about her grandfather at Kamakura, and the wave, and the moment when conservation ends. She thought, 31 seconds. She thought, that's mine. The administrative review took 3 weeks and involved the regional Vorkai Oversight Office and 2 human advocacy legal teams, and 1 extremely sleep-deprived xenolinguistics professor from Edinburgh who had been pulled in again for translation, and who was observed at one point using the margin of a Vorkai administrative document to write what appeared to be a note to himself, reading, they are not going to like this outcome. The facility at Gotemba did not close. The Vorkai did not vacate Earth, because the Vorkai do not vacate anything they have filed the correct administrative paperwork for. What changed was the program parameters, revised through the legal review to include something the original documents had not contained, a clause recognizing that performance metrics collected under coercive conditions are functionally distinct from performance metrics collected under volitional conditions, and that the former are not predictive of the latter, and that any data collection program premised on the former is, in the Vorkai's own administrative terminology, measuring the wrong variable. It was a small change. It was also in the way of small changes that adjust the foundational assumption. Enormous, coordinator Mizuki left the facility at the end of the review period. He sent Miyako a message 6 months later, a brief one, low in apology but not without it, the note of someone trying to compress something complicated into a limited space. He said he had been at the facility for a long time, and had been inside the logic of it for a long time, and that it had taken something external to make him see what the logic looked like from outside. He said he was teaching now in Shizuoka, a small school. Nothing special. He said the kids there were, in his experience, uniformly better at teaching themselves than anyone gave them credit for. Miyako read the message on the train home from the prefectural championships which she won, setting a new personal best in the 200-meter freestyle by a margin that her coach described as, quote, absolutely unreasonable in a way that clearly meant something else entirely. Coach Noguchi watched the replay footage from the race 3 times, and then pulled Miyako aside with the face she used when she was going to say something technical and said, that thing you do in the last 20 meters with your right shoulder. I know, Miyako said. Don't change it. I know. Noguchi looked at her for a moment, nodded once, the precise nod of a person closing a topic that does not need more words. Next year, she said, we're going after the nationals. The facility at Gotemba continued its program under the revised parameters. The revised program produced different data than the original program, because it was measuring different things. The Vorkai Oversight Office noted in the quarterly report that the Gotemba cohort results were anomalous, specifically that the performance ceiling for the revised program appeared to be significantly higher than the performance ceiling for the original program, which was counterintuitive by their models. Because the original program had applied more direct pressure, one of the Xenolinguistics Department's research fellows, writing a paper on the subject, would later attempt to explain this to a Vorkai administrative attaché in terms he could use. Pressure, she said, is not the same variable as belief. Belief is not measurable by your current instruments. The ceiling you were measuring was not our ceiling. It was the ceiling of the model you were using to measure us. The attaché reviewed this with his sensory cluster and said, in the measured cadence of someone encountering a concept, his language did not have a ready word for. You are saying that the variable we needed was not in our dataset. We are saying, the fellow replied, that it was never in any room you were measuring. It was in the rooms you weren't watching. The attaché was quiet for a while. The rooms we weren't watching, he said finally. The dark ones, she said, where people are only themselves. There was a gap in the administrative rotation. Every 4 minutes at the far end of the pool, Res Voratkin had designed the monitoring protocol himself, and he had designed it correctly. And the gap had always been there. He reviewed the original design 11 times in the weeks after the review. He found the gap each time. He could not determine, in any of the 11 reviews, what he would have done differently. The gap was a necessary efficiency, a resource allocation choice that was correct by every standard his models provided. He filed a revision to the monitoring protocol. He closed the gap. He then sat in his observation space above the empty pool. The facility was between cohorts, the water still, and the lanes empty, and the pace clock blank, and he thought about the 11 reviews, and the gap, and what had happened in the pool when he was watching, and what had happened in the corridor when he was not, and he thought about the female subject in lane 4, and the roll in her right shoulder, and the 31 seconds. His bioluminescence was doing the slow, regular pattern the behavioral materials described as neutral administrative. He thought we were measuring the wrong ceiling. He thought 31 seconds of unmonitored performance, and we had no model for where it came from. He thought about the pool, at night, quiet and lit, and the sound of someone entering the water without disturbing it. The sound of something that knows what it is joining what it knows. The administrative lights in the observation space were timed to his occupancy, and after a while they dimmed, and he sat in the dark above the empty pool, his bioluminescence the only light, thinking about variables he did not have instruments to measure. Outside the facility, the mountain was dark, and the valley was dark, and the fog was sitting on the slope of things, the way it always did in late spring, the way it had before the facility came and would after it was gone. In the dark, somewhere, something was moving with the ease of familiarity. No drones catching it, no sensors registering its passage, no model containing its coordinates. The water in the pool rocked gently in its lanes. Somewhere below the mountain, in a city of orange sodium lights and wet streets, and mailbox slots that sometimes held things that changed the shape of the next 12 weeks, Miyako Sato was on a train, the photograph from Kamakura in her bag, her prefectural gold in her bag, her time on the pace clock still hers, 31 seconds hers, and the roll in her right shoulder hers, and the knowledge of the gap in the rotation hers, and the sound of the water joining itself hers, and all of it. The whole category of things that happen in rooms nobody is watching, in the dark between measurements, in the 4 minutes of every survey rotation, when the sensor nodes are looking elsewhere, and the human body is only itself, entirely hers, unmeasured, unoptimized, and very specifically not going anywhere. Haruki was the one who found the gap in the data retention clause. She had the kind of mind that read contracts the way other people read novels, not for plot, but for the places where the narrative quietly changed direction. She had been reading the facility's intake documentation at night, under her blanket with a penlight, for 2 weeks before the final meet, and on the night before, she had folded a piece of paper into a very small square and passed it to Miyako in the breakfast line, with the expression of someone handing over something they have been carrying too long. The paper said, Article 7, Subsection 4, Paragraph 2, the phrase, for the duration of the assessment program, which means the data retention ends at program close. If the program is terminated rather than completed, there is no data to retain. Miyako had read it once, and eaten her rice and said nothing, and thought, of course she's a contract reader. Of course she reads everything. This is exactly the kind of person who would read everything. That night she had lain awake for a long time thinking about what it meant that 12 girls in a Verkai facility had spent 5 weeks building a cooperative intelligence operation out of pool deck, whispers, and pieces of paper and 30 seconds of eye contact in a changing room, and that no monitoring protocol the Vorkai had designed had caught any of it, because the Vorkai had been measuring performance, and the cooperative intelligence operation was not a performance. It was just what happens when people are trying to survive something together. And no one told them they were supposed to ask permission. She thought about what the masked woman had said. The rooms they're not watching. She thought, we were the rooms they weren't watching. She was the room they weren't watching. In the weeks following the meet and the administrative review, the story came out in pieces, the way stories do, not as a single event, but as a series of edges that gradually resolved into a shape. The masked woman was never identified, in any official capacity, as anything other than an unauthorized intruder who had accessed the facility on at least 3 occasions and caused structural disruption to a licensed Vorkai assessment program. The legal review referred to her as the Subject X incident and noted that her interventions had introduced an uncontrolled variable into the program's performance data, which was technically accurate and also one of the most understated sentences in the entire 400-page document. Miyako thought about her sometimes, the dark eyes behind the mask, the ease of her in the water, the way she had known about the shoulder roll, which meant she had been watching Miyako swim with the particular attention of someone who was looking not for the regulation form, but for the thing underneath it. She thought, someone was watching to see what I actually was. She thought about what it felt like to be seen that way, and how different it felt from being measured. She told Noguchi about the shoulder, eventually, not about the facility. There was still a confidentiality clause in the review settlement that she was honoring, less because she was required to, and more because she had decided, on reflection, that the experience belonged to the 12 of them. And she did not want it turned into a news item or a narrative that other people arranged liking. But she told Noguchi about the role, about what she'd understood it to be after 5 weeks of having someone try to correct it. Noguchi listened with the focused silence of a person whose profession is attention. When Miyako finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I knew you knew that. You never said. I was waiting for you to say it first." Noguchi looked at the pool, at the empty lanes, the still water. A coach can point at a thing. They can't make it land. That's not how it works. How does it work? Noguchi looked at her. Someone has to believe it about themselves first. Miyako thought about the masked woman sitting on the edge of the pool at 10 o'clock at night, and the particular quality of her attention, not assessing, not measuring, just present, just watching, with the full weight of someone who has decided that what they are looking at is worth looking at, she said. Someone else believed it first. Noguchi considered this. Then they got there faster than most people do, she said. That's not nothing. That's also not the finish line. The prefectural championships were in late June, which gave Miyako 2 months to train after the facility. The first week back in the municipal pool was strange. The facility's pool had been larger, its equipment better, and there was something disorienting about the familiar smell of the smaller facility, the scuffed tiles, and the pace clock that had never worked quite right, and the lane rope in lane 3 that was always slightly lower than the others. She stood at the block on her first morning back and tried to remember what her body knew before anyone tried to optimize it. She dove. She came out of the water, and Noguchi was standing at the pool end with a stopwatch and an expression that was entirely neutral, which was how Miyako knew the time was good. Again, Noguchi said. She went again. The 6 weeks before the championships were not the facility's 6 weeks. They were Noguchi's, which meant they were hard in a way that had direction, that pushed toward something specific rather than toward a general metric. They were also, in a way that Miyako had not fully appreciated until she had something to compare them to, kind. Noguchi's sessions ended when they should end, not when the algorithm said they should, and the adjustments were the kind made by someone who had spent 30 years watching people swim and had developed, in the process, what she would only call an instinct, but was really something more like understanding. She pushed the shoulder roll into the final 20 meters and left it there, and didn't apologize for it. She pushed the last 50 at full capacity and didn't hold back for the model's projection of where her ceiling was. She swam her fastest when she was tired, because that was when she had come to understand. The body stops arguing with itself and just does the thing it knows. The championships were in Shizuoka, at a prefectural facility that had a scoreboard the size of a small building and bleachers that filled with families and school delegations, and coaches, and one very quiet woman in ordinary street clothes, who was not sitting with any school group and who Miyako spotted in the 3rd row of the eastern bleachers when she was walking to the block for her heat, a woman with dark eyes, and the particular quality of stillness that Miyako recognized the way she recognized chlorine, by something older than thought. She did not look at her. She looked at the pool. She touched the wall and looked at the scoreboard, and the number was the number it was. And from the bleachers there was the ordinary sound of an ordinary crowd responding to an ordinary excellent swim. And also, underneath it, one voice laughing low and warm, in a way that only Miyako heard, or perhaps only Miyako recognized, and then the sound folded into the rest of the noise, and was gone. The Regional Vorkai Oversight Office published the revised assessment program, parameters 4 months after the Gotemba review. The document ran to 60 pages and contained extensive revisions to the monitoring architecture, the performance baseline methodology, and the data retention provisions. It also contained, in Appendix C, a brief section titled Volitional Performance Variables, which attempted to formalize the finding that human performance metrics collected in conditions of full physiological compliance differed systematically from metrics collected in conditions of what the document called self-directed motivation. The appendix noted that the sources of self-directed motivation were not currently quantifiable by available Vorkai assessment instruments. It recommended further research. The research was ongoing. It would be ongoing for a long time. The Vorkai were thorough and patient, and they had access to extensive datasets and sophisticated modeling tools. And they genuinely wanted to understand the phenomenon, which was to their credit, and which was also, Miyako thought, when she read the summary 3 years later, slightly beside the point. She was 20 years old by then, competing at the national level, training with Noguchi in the mornings, and taking courses in applied physics in the afternoons, because she had discovered, to her own mild surprise, that she liked the language of pressure and flow. The mathematics of how things move through resistant media. She read the Appendix C summary on her phone, on the train between practice and class, and she thought about the definition of self-directed motivation, and she thought, it's not a variable, it's a direction. You can measure how fast someone swims. You can measure the forces they generate, and the efficiency of their stroke mechanics, and the neurological latency between stimulus and response. What you cannot measure is the thing that decides to swim fast in the first place. The thing that says, this is mine, and this is me, and no assessment. Matrix gets to tell me where my ceiling is. You cannot put a sensor node in the water and capture the moment when someone stops performing for the apparatus and starts swimming for the thing they are. The Vorkai were looking for it in the data. It was not in the data. It was in the pool in the dark, in the 4-minute gap in the rotation, in the whispers after lights out, in the paper folded to a very small square and passed hand to hand down a breakfast line. It was in the photograph in the front pocket of a duffel bag. A girl at Kamakura, waist deep in summer surf, her grandfather's hand on her shoulder, something off camera making her laugh. It was in the rooms they weren't watching. It had always been in the rooms they weren't watching. The national championships were in Osaka, in a facility with a pool that the organizing committee had described in their promotional materials as the finest in Japan, and which was, Miyako admitted, standing at the block in lane 4, genuinely something. The water was perfect. The starting blocks were perfect. The air was the correct temperature. Everything was optimal. She dove at the beep and swam the 200, the way she always swam the 200, which was the way she had always swum, and no one had ever quite managed to change, and in the last 20 meters, the roll came in her right shoulder. And she used it the way she had used it since Kamakura, since before she knew what she was doing. And the pool was the pool, and the water was the water, and the ceiling was wherever she said it was. She touched the wall. She looked up at the board. The number was new. From the stands, somewhere, someone who was not any of the delegations and not any of the coaches put 2 fingers in their mouth and whistled. One of those shrill, precise whistles that cuts through crowd noise like a key in a lock, the kind that takes practice and intention. Miyako looked up at the stands. She could not find the woman. She could not find any face she knew. In the rows of ordinary faces, watching the scoreboard with the ordinary faces of ordinary crowds who have just seen something worth seeing. She held on to the lane rope and let her breathing slow and listened to the echo of the crowd in the high vault of the hall, the sound of a large space resonating with a lot of people, all deciding the same thing at once. She thought, that number belongs to me, she thought. Everything that went into that number belongs to me, she thought, for no particular reason, or rather, for every reason accumulated over 3 years and 5 weeks, and 1 late-night pool conversation, and a photograph in a duffel bag front pocket, about her grandfather at Kamakura, the hand on her shoulder, the surf coming in. The wave breaks, he had said. That's not the end of the water. That's just what the water does with what it has. She climbed out of the pool. Noguchi was waiting at the pool edge with the stopwatch and the expression, and in Noguchi's eyes, there was something that was not the neutral calibration of a coach watching a time, but something else. Something that was the look of a person who had believed in a direction before they could prove it, and who has just received the proof. Well, Noguchi said. Yeah, Miyako said. They stood at the edge of the pool for a moment in the noise and the light. The scoreboard held the number. The water settled in the lanes. Nationals next year, Noguchi said. Nationals next year, Miyako said. And somewhere above the facility at Gotemba, in the observation space above the empty pool, a bioluminescent pattern pulsed slowly in the dark. Not the pattern of neutral administrative, not the pattern of focused interest, but something the behavioral materials had no entry for. The pattern of a system sitting with the knowledge that it is measuring something it cannot name, and that what it cannot name is the most important thing in the room. The water in the pool below was still. The lights were off. The gap in the monitoring rotation ticked by, 4 minutes of dark and quiet, and everything in it that the instruments could not reach. Somewhere in that dark, the water moved. Not the pumps, not the filtration. Just the water, remembering something, the way water does, settling into its own shape, following its own direction, certain, in the bone-deep way of things, that have always known what they are, and have simply been waiting for the room to stop measuring long enough for that certainty to show. There is a thing that happens in competitive swimming that coaches cannot teach, and that training programs cannot produce, and that assessment models cannot predict. It happens in the last 10 meters of a race when the lactic acid has accumulated past the point where the body's rational systems would advise continuation. When the lungs are pulling air in a way that feels like trying to drink through a narrow straw, when the arms have been moving through water for long enough that they have started to feel like they belong to someone else. At this point, the body does one of two things. It listens to the part of itself that is doing the accounting, the part that knows how much oxygen is remaining and how much the muscles are burning and what the metabolic math says about sustainable pace. Or it listens to the other part. The other part does not do accounting. The other part does not have a language for metabolic math or sustainable pace. The other part is just the animal insistence of a living thing that has decided it will reach the wall, that there is a wall and it will reach it, that the meters between here and there are not the obstacle but the medium, the element, the thing it knows. Miyako had the other part. She had always had it. It was not something that had been given to her in Kamakura, or taught to her by Noguchi, or identified by the facilities, assessment battery. It had been there before any of those things, and it would be there after all of them. The facility had tried to measure it and found the measurement inconclusive. The assessment protocols had tried to optimize it and had not been able to locate it in the data. 5 weeks of structured adjustment and performance correction had not touched it because it was not in the category of things that respond to adjustment. It was in the category of things that simply are. 2 years after the facility review, a Vorkai behavioral researcher named Orcs Veth published a paper in what the Vorkai academic infrastructure called, in rough human translation, the Journal of Adaptive Species Studies. The paper was titled, again in rough translation, Toward a Model of Non-Compliance-Based Performance Enhancement in Socially Organized Species, and it cited the Gotemba incident extensively as the primary case study. The paper's central argument was that the Vorkai assessment framework had made a categorical error. It had modeled human performance as analogous to Vorkai performance, as something that could be optimized by locating and correcting inefficiencies, by applying structured pressure to the deviation zones, by bringing the variable subject into conformity with the predictive model. This was, the paper argued, correct for some species. It was incorrect for humans. For humans, the paper argued, performance was not reducible to a set of correctable inefficiencies. Performance was, at its center, an expression of what the paper called. And here, the translation became approximate. Something like self-reference. A human performing at their best was not a human who had had their inefficiencies corrected. It was a human in the process of being, as fully as possible, themselves. You could not optimize a person's self-reference. You could not locate it on a metric. You could not produce more of it by applying a correction stimulus. What you could do, what the Gotemba cohort had demonstrated, what the masked woman had demonstrated 3 times across 3 program cycles, without ever being identified or caught, was provide the conditions under which self-reference was possible, space for the thing to be what it was, a gap in the rotation, a 4-minute window where the sensors looked elsewhere, and the human body was only its own. Orcs paper was well received in the Vorkai academic community, in the careful and methodical way that well-received things are in communities that move at the pace of their paperwork. It generated follow-up research. It prompted revisions to the standard assessment battery. It was, by any reasonable metric, a contribution to knowledge. What it could not do by its own admission was identify the masked woman. Section 7 of the paper, titled Unsanctioned Intervention Variables, reviewed all 3 Gotemba incidents and concluded, with the careful precision of a researcher who has looked at the data carefully and found it insufficient, that the common element across all 3 cohort disruptions was an external human agent who had introduced morale reinforcement communication, direct physical intervention against program authority, and this was the part that interested Orcs most, what the paper described as a modeling correction. The masked woman had not told the subjects that they were performing badly. She had told them that the model used to measure their performance was wrong. She had pointed at the assessment framework and said, "This is not your ceiling. This is the ceiling of the instrument that is trying to measure you." And the subjects had believed her, not because she had provided data or cited evidence or offered a competing technical framework. They had believed her because she had shown them, by being there, by having been there across multiple program cycles, by sitting on the edge of the pool in the dark and watching a swimmer work and seeing in the right shoulder and the roll and the last 20 meters the thing that the assessment had missed, that she was paying a different kind of attention. You cannot put that in a model. Orcs wrote in the paper's final paragraph, which was as close to a personal statement as Vorkai academic convention permitted. You can describe it. You can say, "It happened," and note its effects. But the quality of attention that sees a person and not a metric, that sees the roll in the shoulder as native intelligence rather than correctable flaw, is not a method, it is a stance. And stances do not reduce to models. We recommend continued study. We note that continued study will not produce the thing we are studying. We note this and proceed anyway, because that is what research does. Miyako read the paper in translation years later and thought about the pool at night and the woman sitting on the edge and the dark eyes through the red mask and the way she had said, "Fast looks like," you with the certainty of someone who had already decided this and was offering it, not arguing it. She thought about what it means to be seen before you are proven. She thought about what she would say if she ever had the chance to say something to the woman who had sat on the pool edge and watched and paid the kind of attention that changes the thing it is directed at. She had been trying to find the right words for a long time. She thought, "I think you were watching because you wanted to, not because you needed to." She thought, "I think you already knew. You were there for the same reason my grandfather was at Kamakura, because watching something move through the element it knows is its own kind of answer to something." She thought, "I don't know if I would have found it without you. I don't know if I would have trusted it." She thought, "Thank you is too small." She thought, "Thank you anyway." She folded the translation and put it in the same drawer where she kept the photograph from Kamakura, the photograph with her grandfather's hand on her shoulder and herself waist-deep in summer surf, laughing at something off-camera. And she went to the pool and dove in and swam the way she swam, which was the way she had always swum, which was the way the body insists on being itself when the room stops measuring long enough to let it. The water closed over her head. She came up on the far side of the turn, arms pulling, shoulder doing the thing it did, and the meters going by like the only honest thing, and her grandfather's words somewhere below, thought in the part of the brain that runs on older code. The wave breaks. That's not the end of the water. The wall came up ahead. She went toward it.